Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dravidian Does History. This is a special one because today I'm not joined by my usual co host, Alan, and so I thought I'd do something special. So I posted on my Instagram and asked if any of my friends wanted to have me answer any questions related to history. And I got a lot of questions. Some of them were interesting, some of them were curious, and some of them were downright personal. But I did manage to answer some of these questions, and they are up on my Instagram and TikTok because we have to do all these things now, right? But that also gave me the opportunity to realize that there are a lot of questions that you can't answer in simplistic 1 minute sessions. So I thought I'd answer some of these questions on our channel here, and maybe we'll go in depth into some of these questions and figure out the answers, and maybe discuss them in such a way that we get a fuller understanding of what I'm talking about, right? So let's go. First question, what's ancient, classical, medieval, and modern India in history? Interesting question, because all of us who have gone to school in India have been taught certain ways of studying history. For example, from the time of the British at least and into the modern era, we study history into primarily three periods, which is the ancient period, the classical period, and then the colonial period, and then modern India. That's how we are traditionally taught history, where the ancient period is anything before the Common Era. The classical period is primarily the Gupta era from around the 4th and 5th century CE up until the 6th, 7th, 8th, or 9th century CE, depending on which region you're studying about or which region you're taught in. And then we have the colonial period or the Islamic period, depending on who's teaching you, that lasts from about the 12th century up until the 20th century when India finally becomes an independent nation and becomes a republic in the 1950. But this is a very simplistic and very biased study of Indian history because this does not take into context the regional, linguistic, and other temporal ways of looking at Indian history. Because India as a whole did not ever, in any period during its entire 5,000 years of recorded history, become one unified state until the Republic of India was declared in January 26, 1950. It is then that we finally have at least one nation that encompasses most of what we consider to be India under one state. Before that, we have had episodes where certain regions were separate from the state that controlled from one region. For example, the Mauryas, two periods during the Delhi Sultanate, and then the Mughals. These were periods when most, if not all, of what is considered India was governed by one administration. But besides that, besides these fleeting moments, never has India been ruled by one state or one dynasty or one power. So studying Indian history in that mold does not really track. And it's also a very Eurocentric view of studying history, which is ancient, classical, medieval, and then modern, because that again does not apply to Indian history, because we never went through periods such as the medieval period or the Dark Ages that is referred to in English or European history. Throughout most of India's history, we were an enlightened, very active global participant. Our societies were always open to outside influences as well as giving out our influences to the rest of the world. And it was always been a trading hub. So influences have come and gone. We have been in contact with most states in the world. So that really changes the perspective in which we can even study history in India. Another problem is that, for example, if we take the classical period, traditionally we are taught that the Gupta period is classical or golden age in India, while it tracks for most of North India to be a classical period under the Guptas. It does not really apply to most of the country below the Deccan because the Guptas never managed to conquer below the Deccan substantially or even really much at all. Even in most of its northern empire, it was a desegregated and a decentralized polity, which meant that most of the power still resided in the regional kings and the regional powers, and the emperor in Pataliputra only had nominal power, really. So, is it really a classical age if only certain parts of the whole of the state was controlled by the empire? So, what then are we to do about the rest of the modern country of India where the Guptas had no influence? Are they not part of India? Are they not part of the classical age? So, answering that question, then again, we have to look at regional histories where, for example, the Ahom. or the Rashtrakutas, or the Chalukyas, or the Pandyas, or the Cholas, or the Gujarapatiharas, or the Palas. These are all periods and empires and states that thrived and significantly influenced their regional histories and traditions and cultures in ways far more influential than the Guptas even did in North India. So, how then do we classify what is classical and golden age for India? Right? So, we can't really classify India or the Indian subcontinent, which is akin to Europe, is more a continent than a country historically and geographically and culturally. We can't really do that minimalistic, simplistic historical categorization. We could do uh, one thing where we study history in a regional way so that somebody living in the Deccan can study their history from a more variegated perspective, where they study ancient history, they study early medieval history, then they study medieval history, which could be applied to states that existed from about 600 CE to about 1500 CE, when even more gigantic Islamic and Persianate states come into existence, and then pre-modern era, where modern technologies are introduced, right? So there are several different ways to study history. So we don't have to stick to classifications of ancient, classical, medieval, and modern. That doesn't really work in the Indian context. As long as you study the whole history and are interested in learning the whole story and are not myopic enough to uh, force external ideas onto these regional histories, I think it would be good. So that's what I wanted to say about the classification of Indian history. We just have to ditch earlier British influenced or even European models and create Indic, extremely Indian ideas of studying history and perspectives to look at history. The next question: why are the Indian number system called Arabic numerals? Another fascinating question, because we know most of the Indians who have gone to school know there's a lot of mathematical and geometrical concepts that we are familiar with in by names, such as the Pythagoras theorem or something like that, already were used in India long before these theories got their European names. And we also know that the decimal number system, which is 0 to 9, and then the existence of 0 as an actual number and not just a placeholder, was tabulated in India around the time of the Gupta era by mathematicians like Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And this is evident in inscriptions from the period and documents from the period as well. And then it traveled to the Arabic world through traders and other educational institutions, where other intellectuals came to India to study in cities like Patliputra and Nalanda and all these great institutions, and then carried this information with them to other regions of the world. And then through the Arabs, it traveled to Northern Africa, and from then it traveled to Europe, and then from them to the English world. That's how this number system traveled to Europe. But because the Europeans got it from the Arab and the Persian world, they named it the Arabian number system or the Arabic numeral system. It is only a happenstance. It is not a legitimate or even a manipulative way of transforming history. It's just that they got it from the Arabs, so they named it the Arabic number system. For the Arabs, they named it the Indian number system. So it's not really a genuine, intentional erasing of Indian influence in the number systems. But we can always understand that this is how it happened. And as long as we are aware of it, and as long as we don't discredit the origins or even existence of the chains through which these mathematical concepts traveled the world, I think it should be okay. Next question. Who built the pyramids if not aliens or slaves? This was actually a funny question to me because it shows a deeply um, misunderstood period of history, as well as a deep misunderstanding of history in general. Because I think it does a disservice to the people who lived before us to think that only aliens will be capable of building structures that are fundamentally fairly simplistic in their structure and their plan. And to say that the structures in Egypt or Petra or all of these places can only be created by aliens because humans were not civilized or cultured or talented enough to be able to come up with ideas in those times. It's kind of a slap in the face to cultures outside the West because that's where usually this kind of statement comes from. For example, the pyramids, we know that the pyramids, the biggest of the pyramids, were created during the oldest stage of um, the kingdom stage of Egypt, which is divided into Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and then the Ptolemaic period. So the pyramids were constructed in the earliest of this, in the Old Kingdom period, and the largest of the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre, which are in Cairo, were constructed relatively in the earliest of these phases, and they were constructed by a father and son duo. They were competitive with each other. Clearly, that's why one tried to outdo the other by building a smaller but taller pyramid on a higher surface. So there's competitiveness there. And if you look at the structures, they're fairly simple because in nature, for example, if you give your children some blocks to play with, they would always build structures which are wider at the base and then towering towards the top because it is more stable in nature. That's how they constructed these buildings as well. They use that basic principle to construct the pyramids. And if you look at the record of pyramids in ancient Egypt, you can see how they evolved over time, where they went from simpler structures, simpler step pyramids, to pyramids that, while being constructed, collapsed in on themselves. So they had to change the plan, which is where the bent pyramid comes in, if you Google it. And then it finally reaches the stage where they can build giant pyramids as magnificent as the great pyramids of Khufu and Khafre. And then, because they don't have the labor force and they don't have enough money and they don't have enough motivation to be able to build structures of equal grandeur, it kind of tapers off. And then again, once the old kingdom collapses and the middle kingdom comes in, and then it collapses, and then the new kingdom comes in, the way Egyptian pharaohs represent themselves and show their power to people changes from pyramidical structures to temples like the ones in Karnak, and Memphis and all these areas, right? So again, the evolution of Egyptian architecture shifts focus. That's why there were no more grand pyramids after the great pyramids of Khufu and Khafre. But people also say, but there are pyramids in China, there are pyramids in Mesoamerica, right? That's because it's an easy to build structure in ancient times when people had limited resources. Men had to build these structures. They did not have engineering technology that we have today, but they did have the skills. They did have the ingenuity. So they used all kinds of different, simplistic to us, methods to build these pyramids. The pyramids in China and Mesoamerica and Egypt are very different in their structure, in their use, and why they were built. For example, the ones in Mesoamerica, they were not funerary chambers. They were not built over the bodies of dead pharaohs. They were platforms for temples at the top. So it's an entirely different idea of what a pyramid was. And then again, in the ziggurats of the Mesopotamians is a similar structure, but because it was again a temple at the top, people don't seem to connect the dots and think of it as a pyramidical structure, but it's the same thing, right? So it's just looking at all of the history and understanding the different perspectives and different uses and the different ways these buildings were constructed would help us understand why we don't need aliens to be able to build rather simplistic but still magnificent structures. And again, slaves were not most often used for the construction of the Great Pyramids, for example. We have documentations, particularly archaeological, of the villages that were constructed and set up for the artisans and paid uh, um, well for the people who constructed these structures that were paid for by the government. So I think one of the documents says that the people worked there for 6 months, and then the rest of the 6 months of the year they cultivated their fields or did whatever they did in their personal lives. So 6 months they devoted for the government, 6 months they devoted for themselves. So it was a give and take, and there were definitely, we know for a fact that Jewish slaves, for example, were not used for the building of pyramids because the Exodus does not take place during that period, and we are not even entirely sure of the historicity of the Exodus. So I think we can put to rest the ideas and the ludicrous claims of aliens and Jewish slaves being the ones responsible for building the pyramids in Egypt. Another question, why do Indians claim they had spaceships and surgery? I giggled at the question because this is something that we find a lot in particularly WhatsApp forwards and ahistorical TikTok videos and Instagram reels a lot. And we even learn a lot of this from our teachers, unfortunately. What this comes from is based on actual historical data and understandings that India used to be a land of extraordinary knowledge and wealth of knowledge as well as riches in other terms as well. And we also had advanced scientific and mathematical knowledge, as mentioned earlier, how the numeral systems created and compiled in India traveled to the rest of the world. Similarly, a lot of mathematical concepts were polished and evolved in India and then traveled the rest of the world. For example, China, in ancient China, they used to refer to India as the birthplace of culture and mathematics and such, because a lot of these people did come to India to learn a lot of this information. We had the earliest examples of what can be called universities in Nalanda. Um, and we have documentation of the traditional university structures of the cloisters and everything being created for the learning of people, the learning of information, a variety of disciplines within India, right? And then that is why, because we are vaguely aware that the world used to look to India for information and scientific knowledge, that remnants of it have influenced us in our thinking. But there's also the problem that a lot of people aren't entirely aware of actual history. So they tend to collate mythology with memories of historical knowledge to create these narratives and stories that frankly turn the whole conversation entirely ridiculous and hilarious, because we never had spaceship. Just because Pushpaga Vimana was mentioned in the Ramayana doesn't mean that we had spaceships. That's just it's so stupid that it doesn't even need to happen in part of a conversation. We did have scientific knowledge. We did do surgeries because we had ways of cauterizing. We had ways of um, doing rhinoplasty and such. And there is information documented in old palm leaves, and it was passed through the guru to the shishya. So that system enabled the transmission of information, and experimentation was highly encouraged in India at that point of time. So a lot of people did learn a lot, and this information was carried through um, Sanskrit verse. So again, the data is encoded in such a way that it is not easy for everyone to grasp it. Only people who are highly learned and highly accustomed to this particular system had access to this information. That's why a lot of it did not travel through most of India's substrata. And it was only reserved for the extremely highly educated Sanskrit educated people. That's why a lot of it is also lost, because again, when you limit information into the hands of a few elites, that kind of destroys the whole point of an egalitarian, well-informed society. And that's probably why even today education is not penetrating India in the same way that it should for a nation that has all access to all kinds of funds to educate its people. Not all states are created equal because not all states treat their citizens equal, right? That's again a tangent. But again, we did have advanced technology, we did have advanced sciences, we did have medicine, we did have a lot of information collected, collated, documented, and spread to the educated classes, but the access to it was pretty limited, and thus it didn't travel too far unless people took the time and effort to learn it from other places, and it did travel to the rest of the world because we had educational institutions that catered to the elites in such a way. But once these structures were destabilized, the information kind of vanished, and we only have the collective memory of having been a place of fabulous wealth and knowledge. But because we have a tendency to exaggerate as Indians, and we have a tendency to think too highly of ourselves without proper backing for that thought, we kind of conflated mythology with history and created these narratives of us having spaceships and all of these superb powers and atom bombs and all of that, which is complete hogwash. But it's based on a kernel of the knowledge that we did once have fabulous knowledge and information, and we were the hub of the world for information and science and wealth. Yeah. Next question. Were Indians always vegetarians? This could be a controversial question because the correct answer is no. India wasn't a predominantly vegetarian culture for most of its history. We did have periods and regions and sects that were entirely vegetarian. There is a consensus that vegetarianism, as we understand it today, of the ahimsa, of not hurting other creatures, and all that came into being during the 5th and 6th centuries BCE after the influence of Buddhism and Jainism. Before that, what we would call the Vedic civilization or even the Hindu civilization, even though it's not, was not much of a pacifist civilization because there are recorded, documented cases and practices of sacrifices, including horse sacrifice. Other animals were also sacrificed. Cattle used to be the primary source of income and sustenance for these tribal groups, and they did drink their milk and did use their milk for cheese and all curds and all that. But the meat was also consumed. It is again mentioned in the Vedic documents as well. So there's no hiding the truth that Indians were a non-vegetarian community always. It was only in with the influence of shamanic traditions like Buddhism and Jainism that a more renunciatory and vegetarian and ahimsa, non-violent influenced way of life came more into the open and spread out to the common people. And even then, it was mostly a matter of choice, of individual choice. That's what we have to remember. It was always a matter of individual choice. It wasn't enforced in the way that it is being forced upon the throats of people kind of today. For example, when I first came to Canada, I remember going to an A&W and one of the Indian cashiers there being gobsmacked by the fact that I had ordered something with beef in it. And being a Malayali, I grew up eating beef. It's delicious. And there is no recriminations for eating beef in Kerala and Bengal and all these places. It's only in other places where they don't know their histories and have been led astray by misinterpretations and religious fervor, not based on any actual religious texts with any veracity at all, that this idea that Indians are always vegetarian and that Rama and Krishna and all these people were also vegetarian, when in fact, the initial documents that bring forth their stories mention how they were not vegetarian. I got into trouble once on Instagram for saying that in the original Ramayana and the Mahabharata text as well, when Rama and Sita and when they go into the jungle, it's mentioned that how they hunted deer and they cooked meat and they used to wear animal skins, right? It's only later when it was deemed that, oh no, they can't be non-vegetarians, that their animal pelts became saffron robes and all that. So if you read the pre-classical Sanskrit, even other versions of these texts, you find that it mentions how they did consume meat, apart from all the fruits and berries, because you can't survive on those in a world, in a time and place like that. So, no, the simplest answer is that India wasn't always vegetarian. Even now, India isn't entirely vegetarian. There are sections of Indian society who are adamantly vegetarian, and that's their personal choice based on probably religious indoctrination. But that doesn't mean that everybody else has to follow those rules because food is food. As long as you're not hurting people, as long as you're not cannibalizing, as long as you're not hurting others while you consume your food, it's good. You can eat whatever you want, especially if you're in areas in the coast where you have access to a lot of seafood. Enjoy the seafood. Don't let other people tell you what to eat and what not to eat. It's personal choice. Okay, what's another question? Oh, do you know about the Black Taj Mahal? So again, this is something that I discussed briefly in one of the videos on my Instagram feed, and I think in another episode of this podcast as well, about the Black Taj Mahal, which is a myth that has been propagated, particularly by the guides who traverse the Agra Fort and other historic buildings in the erstwhile Mughal Empire. So the story goes that Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal for his wife Mumtaz Mahal, planned to build a replica, an equivalent on the other side of the Yamuna River, built entirely out of the black marble, and it was going to be as grand as the white marble tomb where he and his favorite wife now rest in peace forever. But knowing historical information that we have, having studied history, looking at the person that Shah Jahan was, looking at the plans of the structure of the Taj Mahal, we can conclusively say that there was never plans for a black Taj Mahal. That does not add up with any of the information that we have about, for one, the plan of the Taj Mahal as it exists today, and the mention of the tomb in its contemporary period as well. For example, the Taj Mahal was built using the Chaharbagh four-piece garden style introduced to India in a Persianate style by the Turkic and Islamic states during the 12th to 17th century, and the Mughals really took it to the extraordinary scale that we are more familiar with today. And the Taj Mahal was an extremely symmetrical architectural element, and it uses that symmetry to please the viewer and please the people who come to visit it. So, if we take that into consideration, for example, then the presence of another Taj Mahal made of any kind of material on the other bank of the Yamuna doesn't make sense. But what does make sense, and what is supported by archaeological digs in the location as well, is the presence of another garden complex to equally replicate the gardens in front of the Taj and make an equally grand garden on the backside of the Taj as we see it. But in fact, in the time of the building of the Taj Mahal, that side of the Taj Mahal was reserved for the nobility and for the upper class, because Agra was a riverine city, kind of like Venice, in that all the grand mansions of the glitterati of the Mughal Empire and the administration were along the banks of the Yamuna River. So they would have access to the Taj Mahal through the river, and that was where the emperor, for example, and his family would first reach the Taj Mahal and advance to it. Even though the course of the river has shifted slightly, the presence of a garden on the other side of the Taj enables the family to sit in that garden and view the Taj Mahal and enjoy it. So it, and with the reflective pools that are in the original Taj Mahal as well. So a garden makes more sense, and it keeps the symmetry of the whole complex as well, which would not have been kept if there was another Black Taj Mahal built. And there are no records of the plans for Taj Mahal in documentary evidence as well. It is never mentioned in any of the historical documents created during the time, neither by the official documentation of the Mughals or by the unofficial records compiled by travelers like Nicolai Manici and all those people. So we can conclusively say that there was never plans for a black Taj Mahal, but that's just a story concocted by people who had no fuller understanding of what the plans for the garden were. And once it all got run over by the neighboring, vegetation and stuff, people remembered that there was something there, but weren't fully aware of what it was and why, what the intention was. So no black Taj Mahal. In association, I should also mention that um, no, the artisans who helped create the Taj Mahal were not murdered, and they were not punished, so that they would not be able to recreate the magic of the Taj Mahal ever again. For one thing, Shah Jahan was an emperor. He was not an archetypal villain that some people want the Mughals to be. He was an emperor who was fully aware of his responsibilities as a Padishah, which was to create grand monuments. And the Taj Mahal wasn't even his grandest monument in his eyes. Once the Taj Mahal was completed, he still had several other monuments to build, and we have evidence that the people who worked on the Taj Mahal did work on other monuments in the imperial administration, including in the Red Fort of Delhi, because again, Shah Jahan built the whole imperial city of Shah Jahanabad, with the centerpiece being the Red Fort or Qila-e Mubarak, and it had significant influence from the Taj being used in its construction as well. And even in the Deccan, during Aurangzeb's reign, some of these artisans did go and help in constructing some of the structures there as well. We know this because these artisans were highly skilled laborers and they were not easily replaced. So they were not going to destroy such highly skilled laborers and a class of people who are extraordinarily important to the structure of the Mughal imperial identity, because they were builders and they were artisans and they needed these people, and they had workshops and factories compiled of all of these extraordinarily talented Indians and foreigners working in tandem to create these structures. And the architecture as well as the beautification of it through stonework and gold work and calligraphy and all of this. So you can't easily replace these. And we have notches marked by these artisans on the Taj Mahal itself, showing that on this day, this portion was completed by such and such person. And we have identical markings in later period architectural structures, showing that the same person who worked on the Taj also worked in other buildings as well. And this is more detailed in the works of Ebba Koch, who is a fantastic historian as well as architecture guru, we can say, because she has compiled a fantastic collection of books that detail the architectural legacy of particularly the Mughals. So again, so that's another historical myth debunked, I suppose. So I think those are all the questions I can answer today. I don't want this to be an extraordinarily long episode and a boring one, but just a quick one to introduce you to the concept of a Q&A format. So maybe we'll do more of these in the future if we get enough questions, enough interesting questions to answer. So hopefully I have provided some information that you can carry forward and enlighten yourself to the history of India. If you have more questions, you can either comment below or you can contact me on any of my social media, and I'll be probably answering more questions in the coming weeks. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If not, well, what can you do? You've watched this now. Just likes don't really affect viewership, right? Because you are here. You'll come back next week, hopefully. So I hope you had a good time. If you have more questions, don't don't hesitate to ask them, and I won't hesitate to answer them as well. Till next time, goodbye.